If you're wondering about UK Channel 4 documentary about ADHD being a myth, so did I. I am Dr. Ina Kanevsky, professor of psychology. I have ADHD, and I watched it with some commentary because I had thoughts. I will share this with you. I don't think it will be enjoyable, but it is interesting. Let me know what you think. So, we are going to watch this documentary. We're not going to watch the whole entire thing because I don't think I can do that, but we're going to watch some of it and I am going to comment on whatever particularly is aggravating in there or interesting. The quality is not going to be great. Sorry, I am literally filming my laptop right now. So let's start.
I've been a psychiatrist for nearly 25 years. I've written articles, columns, books about health in the UK. But recently there's one diagnosis that has really taken me off guard. 10 years ago, ADHD was relatively rare in children.
It was not rare.
Ever seen in adults.
It was
But now,
not
it's
known.
estimated that over 2.5 million people in the UK have ADHD. It's a condition that includes symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity.
All right, so he's going to completely ignore, and he's probably going to ignore it throughout the whole thing because it's focused on a little boy with ADHD specifically and on him as a man who will be diagnosed with ADHD. Spoiler, he's going to completely ignore what is driving the increase in ADHD diagnosis, and it is that it is now more recognized in people who were identified as female and people who are adults who haven't been diagnosed previously. That's primary driver of this. Oh, and speaking of this person, that's Daniel Amen, who is also quite a sexist, has really very interesting ideas how women are a whole other species, runs clinics, he is a psychiatrist, so technically also qualified, but unfortunately runs clinics where he uses something called SPECT scans to classify ADHD and also to diagnose other mental health conditions. And that scan technique is not supposed to be used that way. It's sort of like phrenology for the 21st century. If you don't know about phrenology, look it up separately. All right.
Too much. They hear too much. They taste too much. They smell too much. So they're constantly distracted.
There's a million conversations all going on at once.
I get so overstimulated where I feel like I'm going to freak out. I turn into a monster.
ADHD brains are literally wired differently.
It's a neurodevelopmental condition. That means it affects how your brain develops and functions from childhood.
Diagnosis of ADHD is booming, and the internet is full of people passionately talking about its symptoms. There's loads and loads of famous people, like practically every famous person you've ever heard of. Ryan Gosling, will.i.am.
Those famous people probably had ADHD 10 years ago when you didn't know about it. It's just either they also didn't know about it or they weren't publicly talking about it. That is why we're seeing all that right now. And of course, saying that it's every famous person you heard of, that's just confirmation bias. That's silly for a trained, qualified person to say.
With Tom Holland, Emma Watson, Simone Biles, Justin Timberlake. But the current understanding of ADHD, that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning that people's brains are wired differently, is not supported by the evidence, according to some of the most respected experts in the field.
So I wonder if the respected experts in the field are going to be a variety of experts or only people specifically who are dismissive of ADHD. I'm gonna guess that it's not going to be, or I don't know, Dr. Barkley or anybody who actually is known for being an expert on ADHD. Well, let's find out.
The feelings, the struggles, the experiences are real. The explanation is false and I would actually argue unhelpful.
I've spent the last 25 years researching the history of ADHD. The disorder is, to a certain extent, a social construction.
All disorders are.
President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
The industry around ADHD, it is about making money at the cost of misery of others.
I was a GP for 35 years and I'm a former president of the Royal College of General Practitioners. It's certainly not a medical condition as far as I'm concerned.
And many experts
For a general practitioner, that's what a GP is, to say that it's not a medical condition as far as she's concerned seems to be a little bit disingenuous to me, because that does not, being a GP does not give you expertise in ADHD. That's not how that works. But I will say, this is important, that years ago, not currently, I used to think like some of these people think. When I first learned about ADHD in graduate school, when I got to the US in the 90s and I've studied the DSM in my master's program, I also thought that ADHD does not need to be treated, medicated, etc., or maybe treated just behaviorally with modifications, with training, etc. And even though I recognized symptoms in myself at the time, I did not think I needed a diagnosis. I did not think that I needed to actually diagnose my children when it was clear that they also had symptoms. And I regret some of that at this point. But let's see what else do these experts have to say, some of whom are quite specifically not experts on ADHD as such, even though they're presented that way.
including some NHS clinicians, are becoming increasingly concerned about the implications of giving children mind-altering amphetamines to treat it.
We are going to look back and think, did we actually put a chemical cosh on an entire developing generation of brains?
I think it'll be looked at in a similar way to using drugs to make people not homosexual anymore earlier in the 20th century. In 100 years' time.
Okay, so I think that is actually deeply, deeply offensive to say or to compare ADHD and what ADHD is to being a homosexual. I don't think I actually need to explain that, why that is offensive.
People are going to wonder, how could we be so gullible?
So, is ADHD a genuine neurodevelopmental disorder? Or is it a myth that people with a diagnosis have brains that are wired differently? And should we be medicating tens of thousands of children with powerful stimulant drugs?
I'm going to pause this here and say that we're not, of course, just medicating children, we're also medicating adults. I have taken 2 different kinds of ADHD medication myself for a while. I had trouble with the side effects, so I'm no longer taking them. I wish I could. But I think the question of could we come up with something better than the medications that currently exist is valid. And it seems like we just recently have come up with something that might be better. It has been a new type of medication released that seems to be quite promising. I don't know. And I will also say, before we get into the weeds of this documentary, that I think that behavior modification techniques for managing ADHD have been significantly neglected, mostly because they take a lot more resources than just giving somebody a pill. So there is also that.
Hello. ADHD diagnosis has more than doubled in children aged 10 to 17 in the last 8 years. And the use of stimulant medication to treat children has increased by almost 90% in that time. Hi, is it Shauna? Yes. Shauna, hi, I'm Max.
Nice to meet you, Max.
Thank you.
This is Mason, and this is Miles. Guys, this is Max. Hey.
I think it's worth noting that the increase in diagnosis of children and increase in use medication is at least partially connected to destigmatization of ADHD and destigmatization of treating it with medication that has been occurring over the last 10 years. Whether or not it's a good thing, well, let's see.
Old Mason was diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed medication 2 years ago.
Hola, buenos dias. My name is Mason, and I have ADHD, and this is my house.
But now, his mum doesn't want him on the drugs anymore, and they've agreed to take part in a carefully monitored experiment to help him come off them.
Miles, Can you just stay there?
Generally speaking, in an experiment, you control and manipulate a variable or several variables, and then you have a dependent variables that you measure. Usually the variables you manipulate, you change one at a time to see what has an effect or does not have an effect on your dependent variable. This is not what's going to happen in this experiment.
What was your motivation? What made you say yes to this?
He started on 20 milligram. He was on that for a few months. Then we went to 30. Then we went to 40. Now that's starting to wear off at 3, 4-ish.
Okay.
He's like that. He switches.
Yeah.
And he becomes angry or upset.
Before Mason was diagnosed, he was prone.
I wonder why nobody considered like switching him to a different medication, changing to extended release or anything like that. I don't know what's going on. I am also not super comfortable with this child being used this way.
To impulsive outbursts and found it hard to focus. Behaviours which still come back when the drugs wear off.
We're going to be told that these are variation of normal behavior, and probably yes, if we're going to look at like a normal curve with most behavior falling under this bell part, and then we have these extremes on the ends, you could say it's a variation, but it's certainly an extreme variation. This is more problematic behaviors than you would expect of a boy's that age. And some of it is dangerously problematic behavior in this particular case. And it doesn't happen out of nowhere. Like, there are reasons that this child is behaving this way, and it's not because he's mistreated at home or doesn't have like good parent or anything, because there's siblings that doesn't exhibit these same behaviors.
Long term, I just want I want him to be able to develop coping mechanisms and different strategies to help on his own without being medicated.
When he's unmedicated, Mason can feel like his brain.
It is valid for a parent to want for a child to develop strategies. And I will say that that was also one of the reasons that when eventually in 3rd grade my son got diagnosed, we also did not medicate him. Now, he had other health issues, so medications would also create additional complications and so on. But part of the reason I didn't want to medicate him at that time is I also wanted him to develop strategies. But there is nothing wrong with teaching the child strategies for how to manage things while the child is also on medication, because those strategies should be taught to other children and to this child all the same. It does not seem like he's been taught strategies at all throughout this whole documentary. But let's see.
Doesn't switch off.
Sometimes I get a headache from thinking of one thing and then one thing just so rapidly.
Yeah. So all the thoughts that are like coming in your mind almost gives you a bit of a headache kind of thing.
Should be
So when
familiar.
he was little and he'd have these moments, I'd say, just like trying to understand it.
Yeah.
Like, can you explain it to me? And he's like, it's like a squiggly moment. Like, I feel all squiggly.
Right.
When you picture ADHD, they are like, it is portrayed as, worst case. You do think in the bad way, don't you? And you think of like the naughty child at school, or like the worst case scenario, and that's what's always portrayed. Whereas Mason isn't that. He likes to mess around and fidget and walk about, and he used to not be able to sit still and stuff. But he's never been like naughty at school.
Basically, she's describing a super stereotyped portrayal of ADHD, which was also the reason many girls were not recognized and diagnosed. When I was a child, In Soviet Union, this was not existent as a diagnosis, as something that was recognized, so that wasn't even an issue. But here in the US or in the UK, girls were not diagnosed because girls were not problem children. You don't have to be a problem child to struggle. It's not just about being a problem to other people. He is clearly describing the problem within himself, the problems that he himself was experiencing that was bothering him. And we're just going to pretend that it's not a big deal.
Diagnosed, what you might be offered is a drug.
These are amphetamine-based or amphetamine-like substances.
In effect, they work in the same way as a slow-release cocaine, which is quite shocking when you use that language.
They do not. They really do not. And it is quite shocking that these experts are presenting these medications this way. The effects are not the same. The process is not the same. It's very, very problematic to refer to medications in this fashion. I do have a whole bibliography that I'm going to link that explains these medications and how they work. The thing is, people who are addicted to cocaine do not forget to take their cocaine. They have cravings for cocaine. People who have ADHD who are on medication very often have a medication compliance problem. That is, they forget to take their medications. I unfortunately always had leftover Adderall or Concerta, whatever I was using when I tried them, because I would forget for days. And I normally did not take them over weekends, for example, just intentionally. No, it does not work like cocaine, and it's disingenuous to say so, especially for somebody who positions themselves as an expert.
What they do is they cause a kind of tunnel vision. So you get more
No.
absorbed in what you're doing.
The young person will feel a little bit less edgy and usually better able to be still for a longer period of time. And I think that
These medications work in the motivation areas of the brain. They do not give you tunnel vision or any of that. That's not what they're for.
that's a big problem, because what you're basically saying is I'm medicating someone into behaving in a certain way rather than I'm medicating them to solve a medical problem. Very different things.
So yes, this was one of the reasons that I was myself resistant to medication for quite a period of time, because I was thinking of it like it has to be an actual medical problem, except it is. No matter what these people say, we have tons and tons of research literature that shows that it is indeed a developmental issue in the nervous system. It's not something that is purely behavior that shows up from somewhere. And listen, by my original training, I am a behaviorist. That is, I am well versed in operant and classical conditioning. I teach learning, but behavior obviously does not happen independently of your brain. And certainly, yes, when we change behavior, we can change what's happening in the brain as well, and vice versa. And behavior is very much dependent on the environment. And a lot of what's going to be further in this documentary is going to be addressing this interaction between behavior and environment, especially our current environment. And a lot of it is actually going to be quite valid. I would agree with some of the things that they're going to say later. But there is no divide, there is no contrast. A medical issue can be a behavioral issue. Dementia is a medical issue, but it is also a behavioral issue. Both can be true.
He was getting 2s and 3s out of 60, and then he started his medication, and this was the first school report that we got where he's achieving where he's supposed to be. He's on par with his peers.
Yeah. Tell me how you feel about medication. What your thoughts about it?
Sometimes I really don't want to take it, but I have to, and it works.
Tell me about why you don't always want to take it.
Because it takes my funness away.
It makes me sad sometimes because it's like two sides of a coin, really. What's better for him? Whether it's to allow the thoughts to be there at 1,000 miles an hour, but him still be himself, or to help him focus more, but he doesn't quite feel himself.
Yeah.
It's horrible that a child has to
this sort of dilemma.
pick which side he needs to be. Do you know what I mean?
For the experiment, Mason is stopping his medication for 6 weeks.
That's what Rex is.
And will then decide if he wants to stay off them for good.
Stopping the medication is one variable, right? Being on medication versus not. Usually in the experiment, you would take measurements of behavior and other variables before making this change, if you're doing it within single subject, and then you take consistent measurements during the experimental change or after to compare. That is not what they're doing. They have not really tracked or measured anything. They're just going to stop the medication, but then they're also going to change a bunch of other things all at the same time.
But before he starts, I want to understand something fundamental. Is there any actual evidence that ADHD brains are genuinely wired differently?
When we describe ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disorder, what we tend to mean and assume by that is there's some way in which some people's brains are functioning rather differently. But in order to say definitively this is because you have a neurodevelopmental disorder, you need to have some evidence based on the functioning of the brain or body.
We have, again, citations are provided. You're welcome to read the studies. We also have evidence from genetics. We have lots of research on ADHD being indeed a neurodevelopmental difference.
Hello.
Hi, very nice to meet
Hi,
you.
I'm Max. I've come to see Professor Katya Rubia, an expert in brain imaging.
Here's my office.
So, Professor Rubia, thank you so much for meeting me today. So, can you just explain? So, what's your area of research? What's your area of expertise?
I'm a world expert in imaging of ADHD and have done this for 30 years. I use MRI, brain scanning, so magnetic resonance imaging, which is the imaging technique with the best spatial resolution. And I look at the structure and the function and the connectivity of the brain in people with ADHD.
One of the phrases that I hear is,
Yeah.
you know, from people with ADHD, it's like my brain is wired differently.
Yeah.
I hear that quite a lot.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Based on group statistics, in groups of people with ADHD have different, we call it connectivities. So these connections are less strong in ADHD, but the latest studies show that there are very tiny differences. Some statistical methods have actually shown that many children with ADHD have normal brains. I don't think you necessarily have to have a brain difference to behave differently. It's just a cultural definition anyway. I mean, all the diagnostic criteria are based on a group of psychiatrists sitting on a table and making it up, basically, or based on the evidence. But coming to a concept.
Is it based on the evidence or are they just making it up? And yes, the original definition was not based on brain studies as such. It was based on behavioral observations and on separating basically more extreme ends of these behaviors from more common ends of these behaviors. Culturally, well, we find ADHD all over the world. It's not culturally specific to UK or US or anywhere else. It exists in other countries and is diagnosed in other countries as well. And psychiatrists, again, do not come up with these things out of the blue. They are doing it based on research. I do not know what specific new study she's talking about. I'm going to try to find it, but various specific studies are finding various specific differences.
Answers based on the evidence, but they're quite arbitrary and they change all the time.
Have there been any studies done on the structures of the brains of people without ADHD?
Mm-hmm.
Do they see any of these things?
So there is a normal variation because everyone is different. You know, ADHD is not a definition which is absolute. Like you have, and like, because it's not a medical condition, we don't have a brain scan where you can say.
She's correct. We do not at this point have a precise way to diagnose pretty much any mental condition. Anything that's in your brain doesn't basically not a tumor, right? Like we struggle with identifying what really is going on because our technology is not there yet. And what she's talking about, even though she's an expert on doing these scans, again, we are not necessarily looking for what we're supposed to be looking or where we're supposed to be looking in those particular scans. And the way they're talking about regular brains, neurotypical brains versus ADHD brains, that is strange to me, because you would not be looking at ADHD brains and saying they're different in this way without knowing what they're different from. So of course they're compared to typical brains, which also have variability with them. That's why I usually tell people that there isn't really, like, neurotypical is sort of an abstract concept. There is no actual typical brain, right? Yes, all of our brains are in fact different.
You have abnormality here, now you're ADHD. This is not how it works. It's a concept which is based on behavior.
It is.
We in the society decide, or the psychiatrists decide, at this point it becomes abnormal, and at this point it's within the norm.
The scientific findings of something characteristically different that marks out people who get a diagnosis from people who don't is entirely absent. This is a classic example of what sociologists refer to as a social construct.
Not quite, though. It is not a classic example by any means. It's something that is measurable, it's something that is observable, and yes, it is something that we decided to label with a particular name. That is all of the mental health conditions. You might as well say that no mental health conditions actually exist, because all of them are diagnosed behaviorally. Pretty much everything in the DSM is diagnosed behaviorally. From my point of view, diagnosis is a label. It's a label for a set of symptoms, right? These symptoms, well, we may keep refining them and narrowing them down. That's why they keep changing and adjusting over time as we come to better understanding of various issues and conditions. That is all normal, natural, and expected process. Behavior exists in the material reality of the world. People behave, objectively speaking.
Doesn't exist in the material reality of the brains and the bodies, but exists in the subjective imagination of the people who came up with the concept.
But of course, we know the brain is highly plastic, and you can change the brain. And if you change your behavior, your brain will change. And
True.
I think one thing people don't really understand very well, the public, is that the brain and the behavior are the two sides of the same coin.
True.
So if you change your behavior, your brain will change.
So I've discovered that there's currently no marker that distinguishes one brain with ADHD from another brain
Oh,
without
no.
it. And so you can't diagnose it from a brain scan.
We pretend you
If
didn't know
changes your
before?
life, you can fundamentally change your brain. Now, that to me is just incredibly positive. And I can't help but think of Mason, the experiments he's doing. It makes me really hopeful.
There are undoubtedly people who are distractible, inattentive, perhaps a little chaotic in their lives, perhaps find a lot of everyday things quite a struggle. But are they suffering from some kind of neurodevelopmental condition? There is no evidence that that's the case.
But I think
That is a very disingenuous thing to say, because, again, there is tons of evidence that that is the case. We have studies upon studies that have looked into this, looked at various aspects of it. There's one that's quite recently come out. Like, we know that dopamine receptors are involved. We know that motivation pathways are involved. We know that sleep disruption is involved. It's really weird to me that we have a psychiatrist who should know all these things, going to these supposed experts who should know all these things, and then none of them know anything.
it has more to do with where we as a society decide this is where this behavior is becoming problematic, and this is where we're going to decide that it's a disorder.
It's like a big cultural experiment that we're drugging so many young people's developing nervous system. We really have very little idea about what the long-term consequences might be for these people.
Actually, we have studies on long-term consequences. One significant long-term consequence, by the way, is that people whose ADHD has been medicated are much less likely to suffer from addictions as they grow up. And there are additional other studies, again, on long-term effects, which I will link for you to find out. We are going to pause here. I will resume after the commercial break in a separate video.